Colonel Michael Harrison stood in the operations tent at Long Bin in March 1967 and stared at a map marked with Australian patrol routes with the expression of a man who was attempting to understand something that violated every principle of conventional military logic. The Australian patrol routes did not follow established trails. They did not follow ridge lines or natural corridors. They simply went deep into terrain that appeared on maps as dense jungle, marked with no distinguishing features. The Australian patrols disappeared into that terrain for extended periods, sometimes 5 days, sometimes 10 days, sometimes longer. When they emerged, they had intelligence. They had identified enemy positions. They had located supply caches. They had documented Viet Cong movement patterns. But how they obtained that intelligence remained largely mysterious to American military observers. Harrison had received a briefing from an Australian liaison officer named Major Peter Ashford. Ashford had explained the basic methodology. The Australian patrols went deep into terrain where the Viet Cong expected no American presence. The patrols moved slowly and quietly. The patrols observed enemy activity without engaging. The patrols returned with intelligence that American search and destroy operations could then act upon. It sounded simple when Ashford described it, but Harrison recognized that the description was incomplete.
There was something about how Australian patrols operated that was not being fully explained. "Colonel, why do your patrols consistently go deep into the densest jungle?" Harrison asked during the briefing. "Why not stay on the perimeter where you can maintain better security and easier communication?" Ashford considered the question.
The Viet Cong expect us to stay on established routes and established patrol areas. If we go into the densest terrain, the terrain that the Viet Cong believe is impenetrable, we can observe them when they believe they are unobserved. That is the advantage, but the risks are substantial, Harrison said. Deep jungle terrain is extremely difficult to navigate. Communication becomes problematic. Extraction becomes difficult. If something goes wrong, rescue becomes nearly impossible. The risks are substantial, Ashford acknowledged, but the intelligence value is correspondingly substantial. We are not attempting to dominate terrain. We are attempting to gather intelligence by being present where the Viet Cong does not expect presence. This conversation highlighted a fundamental difference in how Australian and American military approached operations in Vietnam. American military doctrine emphasized controlling territory and establishing secure positions. American patrols operated from established bases, followed established routes, maintained secure communication and extraction capabilities.
Australian military doctrine emphasized gathering intelligence through covert presence in terrain where American military presence was not expected. Australian patrols went deep into the densest jungle, away from established routes, accepting the risks associated with operating in extremely difficult terrain. The American approach was rational from a military perspective. It emphasized security, communication, and the ability to respond to problems that might occur during operations. The Australian approach was also rational from a military perspective. It emphasized intelligence gathering through covert observation, accepting the risks associated with operating in the most difficult terrain. But the approaches represented fundamentally different philosophies about how to conduct operations in jungle warfare. American patrols would encounter Viet Cong in established operational areas, engage in firefights, call in air support or artillery, attempt to destroy the enemy force through application of superior firepower. Australian patrols would move deep into terrain, observe Viet Cong activity from concealed positions, return with intelligence about enemy positions and movement patterns, allow American rifle companies to conduct operations based on that intelligence. The Australian approach was slower and less dramatic. It did not result in visible combat engagements or immediate enemy casualties, but it resulted in intelligence that allowed for more effective subsequent operations. By April 1967, American military leadership at MACV was beginning to recognize that the Australian approach, while different from American doctrine, was producing results. Australian casualty rates were lower than American casualty rates. Australian intelligence gathering was more effective than American intelligence gathering in the Australian area of operations. But understanding that the Australian approach was effective did not mean understanding how the approach worked, or how it could be replicated by American forces. A military observer named Captain James Whitfield was assigned to accompany an Australian patrol to observe how the methodology actually functioned in the field. Whitfield was a career Army officer with experience in airborne operations. He was considered a tactical expert and was believed to be capable of understanding and documenting how Australian patrols operated. Whitfield participated in a 10-day reconnaissance patrol with an Australian SAS team operating in the Long High Hills. The patrol was led by a sergeant named Duncan, the same sergeant who had trained American combat engineers in concealment methodology. From the moment the patrol crossed into the operational area, Whitfield was confronted with methodology that contradicted everything he had been taught about military operations. The patrol did not move on established trails. When trails were encountered, the patrol carefully avoided them. The patrol moved through dense vegetation across terrain that required constant navigation and constant adjustment of route. The pace was glacial. Whitfield had expected to cover significant distance each day. Instead, the patrol covered perhaps 2 kilometers in a full day of movement. The pace was not constant. The patrol would move for 15 minutes, then stop for 30 minutes. The intervals were irregular. The patrol maintained almost complete noise discipline. Soldiers moved with extraordinary care regarding every step. Equipment was secured so that nothing rattled or clinked. Water was consumed from collapsible canteens that made no noise when full. By the end of the first day, Whitfield was exhausted. His muscles ached from the constant careful stepping. His mental concentration was exhausted from the constant focus on moving without making noise. He questioned whether he would be able to continue the patrol for 10 days. Duncan observed Whitfield's exhaustion without comment. On the second day, as the patrol was preparing to move, Duncan approached Whitfield and made a simple observation. "You were thinking about the destination. You were focused on getting through the 10 days. That is wrong. You must focus on each moment, each step, each breath. The destination does not matter. Only the present moment matters." This advice seemed absurdly philosophical for a military context. But as Whitfield continued the patrol, he came to understand what Duncan meant. The patrol was not attempting to accomplish a military objective through aggressive action and firepower. The patrol was attempting to exist in the jungle in such a way that the Viet Cong would not detect the patrol's presence. Existing undetected required a completely different mindset than conducting conventional military operations. It required focusing on each moment, on each step, on each breath. It required accepting that progress would be slow and that the mission was not about covering distance, but about gathering intelligence through covert observation. On the 5th day of the patrol, Whitfield observed the methodology produce results. The patrol had positioned itself on a hillside overlooking a valley where Viet Cong activity had been suspected. The patrol had remained motionless for 6 hours, observing the valley. At one point, a Viet Cong squad moved through the valley. The patrol did not engage. The patrol simply observed and documented.
The Viet Cong squad apparently was completely unaware of the patrol's presence approximately 200 meters away. After the Viet Cong squad had moved on, Duncan turned to Whitfield and made a simple statement. "That is why we go deep into the bush. That is why we move slowly. That is why we accept the risks. We gather intelligence that the enemy does not know we have gathered. We observe the enemy when the enemy believes he is unobserved."
Whitfield began to understand the methodology intellectually. But understanding intellectually was different from understanding operationally. The operational understanding required experiencing firsthand the exhaustion, the fear, the constant mental focus required to move through dense jungle without being detected. By the 10th day, when the patrol extracted, Whitfield had developed a profound understanding of how Australian methodology functioned. But he also had deep respect for what the methodology demanded. "This is not for everyone," Duncan had told him during the extraction. "This methodology requires accepting that you will be uncomfortable. You will be afraid. You will be exhausted. You will question whether you can continue. But if you accept those things and move through them, you develop capability that most soldiers do not possess." Whitfield returned to Long Bin and wrote a detailed report on his experience with the Australian patrol. The report documented not just the tactical methodology, but also the mindset required to implement that methodology effectively. The Australian approach to jungle warfare is fundamentally different from the American approach, Whitfield concluded in his report. The American approach assumes that we can dominate terrain through superior firepower and rapid movement. The Australian approach assumes that we cannot dominate the jungle and should not attempt to do so. Instead, the Australian approach emphasizes becoming part of the jungle environment, moving slowly and quietly, gathering intelligence through covert observation. This approach requires accepting risks and accepting that progress will be slow. But it produces intelligence that allows for more effective subsequent operations and results in lower casualty rates for the reconnaissance element. Whitfield's report was reviewed by Colonel Harrison and by other MACV leadership. The report confirmed what had been observed about Australian effectiveness. But the report also raised a question that military leadership found troubling. Could the American military adopt Australian methodology? The methodology required accepting a fundamentally different philosophy about how to conduct military operations. It required accepting that going deep into the densest jungle was preferable to maintaining security on established routes and established patrol areas. American military culture valued visible progress, measurable results, security of personnel. The Australian methodology required accepting invisible progress, results that were evident only to those with intelligence training, and significant risk to personnel. By May 1967, American Special Operations units were beginning to experiment with Australian-style deep reconnaissance patrols. The experiments were not always successful initially. American soldiers trained in conventional military methodology had difficulty accepting the slow pace, the constant noise discipline, the extended duration in the field without obvious progress. But gradually, American soldiers began to recognize the value of the Australian approach. Intelligence gathered through deep reconnaissance patrols was significantly more reliable than intelligence gathered through conventional patrols. Enemy casualties resulting from operations based on deep reconnaissance intelligence were higher. American casualties from the reconnaissance element itself were lower when using the Australian methodology. By 1968, American Special Operations units were conducting regular deep reconnaissance patrols using methodology derived from the Australian approach. The methodology was being taught in training programs. American soldiers were being trained in noise discipline, slow movement, extended observation capability. But the American adoption of Australian methodology was incomplete. American patrols still maintained radio communication to a greater extent than Australian patrols. American patrols still attempted to maintain extraction capabilities to a greater extent than Australian patrols.
American patrols still seemed to retain some of the orientation toward conventional military operations that characterized American military culture.
The Australian approach was being absorbed, but it was being adapted to American military context and American military culture rather than being adopted wholesale. Duncan, the Australian sergeant who had trained Whitfield and countless other American soldiers in deep reconnaissance methodology, observed this adaptation process with something approaching understanding. "The Americans cannot adopt our methodology completely," Duncan told an Australian officer. "The Americans are too oriented toward firepower and rapid response. But the Americans are adopting the principles. They are learning to move slowly and quietly. They are learning to value intelligence gathering over direct action. That is progress." By 1969, the impact of Australian deep reconnaissance methodology on American special operations was becoming visible. American reconnaissance patrols in the Australian area of operations were conducting operations using methodology that had been developed by Australian SAS and that had been adapted for American use. The effectiveness was measurable. American Special Operations units that had adopted Australian methodology showed superior results compared to units that had maintained conventional American methodology. Intelligence quality was higher. Casualty rates were lower. Subsequent operations based on reconnaissance intelligence achieved higher success rates. But the change in American methodology was not celebrated or publicly acknowledged. It was incorporated quietly into training and operational doctrine, without explicit acknowledgement that the methodology had Australian origins. By 1970, when the Vietnam War was winding down for most American forces, American Special Operations units had fundamentally changed how they conducted deep reconnaissance operations. The change was based on principles that Australian soldiers had developed and that American soldiers had been forced to learn through observation, training, and operational experience. The slouch hat and the boots had been visible symbols of Australian military adaptation. The deep reconnaissance methodology represented something less visible but equally significant. It represented a change in how American military personnel approached a fundamental type of military operation. This change had come about not through doctrinal directives from senior leadership, but through the gradual recognition that a different approach was more effective, and the willingness to adopt that approach despite its contradiction to established American military philosophy. Colonel Harrison, who had initially questioned why Australian patrols went deep into the densest jungle, eventually came to understand and accept the Australian methodology. By 1969, Harrison was advocating for the adoption of Australian methodology by American Special Operations units. "The Americans were slow to learn," Harrison observed in a memo to MACV headquarters. "But the Australians have developed an approach to deep reconnaissance that is superior to our conventional methodology. The approach is uncomfortable for American soldiers because it contradicts our training and our culture. But the approach produces results that justify the discomfort." This assessment, coming from a senior American officer, represented a significant acknowledgement. The Australian methodology was superior. American soldiers could learn the methodology. The learning would be difficult, but it was necessary for improved effectiveness. By the time the Vietnam War ended, the transformation in American deep reconnaissance operations was nearly complete. American soldiers who had been trained in Australian-style deep reconnaissance methodology were more effective and suffered lower casualty rates than soldiers who had been trained in conventional American methodology. This transformation would persist long after the Vietnam War ended. Subsequent generations of American Special Operations soldiers would be trained in principles derived from Australian methodology. The fact that the methodology had Australian origins would often be forgotten, but the principles would persist. One particularly significant aspect of the Australian methodology was the concept of going deep into the densest terrain
rather than attempting to control or maintain security in accessible areas.
This principle seemed counterintuitive to American military culture, which valued security and control. But the principle made sense from a reconnaissance perspective. If you wanted to observe an enemy that was expecting to operate in established terrain, you had to be present in terrain where the enemy did not expect presence. That meant going deep into the densest jungle, the terrain that most military forces avoided. The Australian approach accepted that going deep into dense terrain was uncomfortable and risky, but the approach also recognized that the discomfort and risk were the price of gathering intelligence that could not be obtained in any other way. American soldiers, when they came to understand this principle, recognized its validity. The discomfort was real, the risk was real, but the intelligence gathered was worth the discomfort and the risk. By the year 2000, military special operations units around the world were using methodology that derived from Australian deep reconnaissance principles. The methodology involved going deep into terrain where conventional forces would not operate. The methodology involved moving slowly and quietly. The methodology involved extended observation periods without engagement. None of these principles originated with the American military. All of them derived from Australian methodology developed during operations in Vietnam. But the Australian origins were often lost to history. The methodology became integrated into standard special operations practice without clear attribution to Australian sources. Duncan, who had trained so many American soldiers in the principles of deep reconnaissance, eventually retired from the Australian military and worked as a consultant to military organizations around the world. He trained military personnel from multiple nations in deep reconnaissance methodology. His training was always focused on the same core principles that he had demonstrated to Whitfield and to countless other American soldiers decades earlier. Go deep into terrain where the enemy does not expect presence. Move slowly and quietly. Accept discomfort and fear. Gather intelligence through covert observation. The intelligence gathered will enable more effective operations. These principles, simple in statement but demanding in implementation, became the foundation for how military organizations around the world conducted deep reconnaissance operations. When Duncan died in 1991, his obituary in military journals acknowledged his role in developing Australian deep reconnaissance methodology and his influence on how American and other military organizations approached deep reconnaissance operations. But the broader significance of what Duncan had taught, that military organizations could improve their effectiveness by accepting uncomfortable approaches that contradicted their established doctrines, was less explicitly acknowledged. That significance persisted nonetheless. Military organizations that had learned from Australian example recognized that effectiveness sometimes required accepting approaches that contradicted established doctrine. That acceptance, while difficult, was necessary for adaptation to specific operational environments. The slouch hat remained a symbol of Australian tactical adaptation, but the deeper significance of Australian influence on American military operations lay in less visible domains. The engineering methodology, the training methodology, the reconnaissance methodology. All of these represented Australian willingness to adapt to environmental pressures. All of them represented American willingness to learn from an ally. All of them represented the possibility of institutional change driven by recognition that a different approach was more effective than established doctrine. Whitfield, the American captain who had participated in the Australian patrol and had written the report documenting Australian methodology, remained in the military and eventually achieved the rank of colonel. Throughout his career, Whitfield advocated for the adoption of Australian methodology by American Special Operations units. By the time Whitfield retired in 1985, Australian-style deep reconnaissance had become a standard component of American Special Operations training. Whitfield had been instrumental in that transformation. But the transformation had been driven by recognition of effectiveness, rather than by Whitfield's advocacy alone.
When Whitfield was interviewed about his experience with Australian patrols, he always returned to the same core understanding that Duncan had attempted to teach him decades earlier. The Australian approach was fundamentally about accepting that you cannot control the jungle. You can only adapt to it. You can move through it slowly and quietly. You can observe from positions of concealment. You can gather intelligence without engaging, but you cannot dominate it. Once you accept that, everything changes. Your approach changes. Your expectations change. Your effectiveness improves. This understanding, communicated by Duncan to Whitfield and by Whitfield to subsequent generations of American military personnel, became the foundation for how American Special Operations Forces approached deep reconnaissance operations. The slouch hat and the boots were visible. The deep reconnaissance methodology was less visible. But both represented Australian influence on how the American military adapted to operate more effectively in challenging environments.